But for today, it's my extreme pleasure to introduce Gregory Euclid. Greg's coming to us live from Minnesota, where he has had a long career as an high school art educator, and is currently teaching in Savage, Minnesota, which is kind of outside Minneapolis. In addition to his commitment to education, he's an incredibly acclaimed artist. He's shown at numerous major institutions, including right here in MASS MoCA, the Minneapolis Institute of the Arts, Toledo Museum of Art, Museum of Art and Design New York, featured in Juxtapoz magazine, Art News. He's a recipient of a NEA grant, Minnesota Artist Initiative grant, a Jerome Fellow, McKnight Fellow, and he's just a really, really incredible artist. And one of these things too is that whether you know it or not, you probably have one of his art pieces in your pocket right now, that he was a designer among many albums for the cover of the Bon Iver 2011 self-titled album, which is Grammy Award winning. And so he went on to continue designing many albums about his own work, and he just keeps going and going and going. And I think what is so inspiring about Gregory is that for as long as I've known him and certainly been aware of his work, that his commitment to teaching has never wavered. It's always been integral to not only his own practice, but his own livelihood, of course. And I can't wait to hear more about it, but I'm sure that he could be a full-time exhibiting artist if he wanted to, but he's really committed to his students and his communities that he's a part of. So Gregory, take it away, man. Can't wait to learn more.
Anything specific that you'd like to have me touch on so that I meet all your expectations? I'll talk about being a teaching artist, and I can talk about my work as well, but anything else that you'd like me to touch on?
I know I would just love to hear too, not only kind of that work-life balance of when you're finding time, not only to do both, but I'm always so amazed by the nuts and bolts of it. What's your interactions like with your students? Do they know Gregory Euclid, the art star? I was also just a teacher who gave me a C on my last assignment. Like, I kind of love to learn a little bit about that dichotomy. And I know so much of your practice is inspired by the local, what is literally around you, some of the things you're picking up from your yard, and you can see how much the life is inspiring the work. And of course, Jeffrey and any of the other educators, if y'all have questions, please blurt them out or put them in the chat.
Yeah, I don't know if I can see the chat, but just blurt them out. I'm totally open to saying, like, call me out on stuff. Anyways, thank you guys for having me. It was really great to look at the work and to see the diversity. And, being an educator, it is difficult. And just to answer your question, Nathan, about like, how do you balance things? In reality, it ends up being a game between, I think inherently artists are kind of selfish. Like, we'd like to have a ton of time on our own to research and to make work and do these things. But the reality of the situation is that there's for me anyways, there's like a yard that I have to tend with, and there's, raising children and trying to, have a successful marriage and trying to, like, just do all these other things that come into your life. As you get older, you tend to have a lot more, plates that you're spinning, and it becomes kind of tricky, and you got to hatch out time to make your work. And I think some people can do that. Some people have the ability to say, like, oh, I've got an hour here, I'm going to go squeeze that in. My practice has never been that way. Like, I'm one of those people who just works on 40 different projects at once, and I'll be working for a week straight, and then all of a sudden something will make sense and it gels, and then it takes a new direction, or so my work, traditionally it's two-dimensional, it's three-dimensional, it's installation based. I'm doing a lot of different things, so it's never like, oh, I'm going to be working on this one drawing that's over here on the wall. I'll be doing, like I said, 7 different experiments in the studio at once. And all of a sudden, one of those experiments will kind of stand out against all the other ones. And then that's the direction I'll continue to go. So for me, like, having 2 hours, especially during this time period, that was like really, really rough, because I'm teaching. My wife she's a professor, she's teaching. We have kids that are supposed to have education, they're getting a daily thing coming to them saying, like, oh, they should be doing this today. And all of that combined with, like, where do you get groceries? that was rather stressful. So for me, it's been kind of like a dark time in terms of creativity, because I am one of those people who just needs weeks on end to come up with something, as opposed to just, punching in an hour here, an hour there. So if there's one thing I would say that I'm able to do, it's to adapt. I mean, when you say like art style, that word makes me want to cringe, but like my students, to answer that question, I will have one student a year who will be like, you have your own Wikipedia page. And they'll be upset with me for never mentioning that. And if I do then have 2 or 3 kids come up to me and say like, how come you don't talk about your own work? If I do start to talk about my own work in class, frequently what will happen is I'll hear someone in the hall, oh, he's so full of himself. Like all he does is talk about himself. So it's like you can't win that game. And I would rather err on the side of not talking about myself, because that seems less offensive to me, like to not tell people that I did all these things than to be like the person who's in front of them, like bragging about themselves, because I've had that professor and you're like, okay, just teach us, right? So yeah, that kind of thing is always like a tightrope that you have to walk. And I like to, I mean, there are enough other artists out there who do phenomenal work 10 times better than mine that I can use as references. So one thing I will talk about in class when I'm talking to students, though, is just like that thing that I'm talking about right now, is that like being adaptive, being able to take a horrible situation like what we just are going through now and try to make something good out of it. So what I did is I started doing a painting a day after we put my kids to bed. I have a 3-year-old and a 5-year-old. And I just said, like, around 8:30 at night, I'm going to start painting and just see what happens. And it didn't have to be any like grand gesture. There was no like theory behind it. It was just like, let's stay active. Let's do something interesting that's like kind of fun, just stress relief, right? It's art therapy. So I started doing those things, and then I would sell the prints for like $35 online of these works. And it just kind of was a way for me to interact with an audience. Since my gallery show that I had a museum show that was at the museum in Winona here, the Maritime Museum. That was canceled because of, which was a total drag, because we had like, it was like 40 some works all hung in the gallery space. And then 2 weeks later, they closed it down. So the show was supposed to be up for several months, and it just like, nothing came of it. So a couple people got to see it, and that was kind of depressing. So like I felt like I wanted to interact with an audience in some way. So doing this painting a day type thing where I posted it and like let people respond to it seemed like a good way for me to kind of have some interaction with not only the materials again and like kind of thinking about ideas, but also like, hearing feedback from people in the kind of stead of, having a real gallery show or a real, museum show. So that was kind of an important thing to me. And I think all throughout my career as an educator, that has kind of happened frequently. So I know previously, Nathan, you mentioned something about the whiteboard experiments. So I was teaching in Prior Lake, Minnesota, and they kept increasing the number of students in the class to the point where I was up to 40 kids in a class teaching 6 classes a day. And I just felt like a machine. I felt like they weren't really interested in art education. They just wanted to have the fact that kids went through an art class, and anytime, class size, 40 kids in a 40-minute long class, you're barely able to get through attendance by the time, by the time you get through that, and trying to get all supplies out to everyone is just, I usually have no problems with classroom management, but this was just like day after day after day stressful. So during my lunch period, what I would do is start drawing on the whiteboard behind me. And I started making these drawings that if you want to roll the slideshow, we can kind of go through some of these different things that I've done that are kind of a response to my views or positions of landscape, as well as some of the things that I've done that were just kind of reactionary to the times. So if we hit the first slide there, this is a series that I did called Scrape. And what I would do is just take a gob of paint. We're talking like a large, not a palette knife, but one of those things that they use for mudding homes, where they put on the sheetrock and the whatever that joint compound. So I took one of those giant things and just filled it with paint, and then just dragged the paint down so that you could see the actual physicality of the paint. And then I built these landscapes on top where there was like 2 inches sticking out from the surface. So the point where you can see all of that, like trees and stuff like that up there, that's actually sticking out, you know, a good 1 to 2 inches, and it's just thick with paint. And then behind that, I painted some, like a little scenic thing. So this was addressing the idea that I've always, throughout my career being a landscape painter, been somewhat concerned about the fact that I use paint, which is a petroleum-based product, and like these pigments that are mixed with the, you know, the acrylic. Or if it's oil, I started off using oil, then I got shaky in the hands and I had to stop using oil paint. But so I moved over to acrylic, but then I was like, I'm using plastic to describe land and land use. That seems really, you know, at odds with each other. So, I've always been interested in where paint comes from, where pigment comes from, and how paint is like created or made, and then how I'm using that as a way to make awareness about our land use and our our, you know, ecosystems and so on. So I wanted to kind of make a idyllic landscape on top of this, you know, drawn down area of paint, and then introduce elements of trash into it. So there's all sorts of little bits of styrofoam in the bottom part of that landscape, as well as buckthorn, which is an invasive species that we really battle here in the Midwest. So this is one of those series from that. If you'd like to hit the next slide there. This is a piece of work that's typical of my work. You can see in the sky, there's like spray painted pieces of styrofoam that I find in the landscape. And I use them as clouds, and I do a little bit of drawing in there, and then there's painting in there, and then there's paper becoming topography. And so in a work like this, I'm really interested in creating different viewpoints, different vantages. So like you never really have an orientation of where you are. There are some aerial views in there. There are some vistas where you're like moving into the landscape. There are some drawn trees, and then there are actual trees. So this kind of combination of the modes of representation, where sometimes things are illusionistic and sometimes things are real, but then sometimes the things that are real are miniature. And so all these different perspectives colliding into one space, for me, is similar to how when I'm walking through the forest, I'm imagining myself being in a massive forest with the canopy, but I'm also paying attention to like what's happening within the bark of that one tree. Like there's little bits of sap dripping down. And so this micro macro approach within my life that I pay attention to is trying to be kind of made visible in these types of work. And like Nathan, you had mentioned collections. Yeah, I think it would be very easy for me to go to a hobby store and just buy trees, but that would defeat the purpose for me. So what I'm really interested in is kind of taking things from my walks and creating new things from them. So in here, you'll see those little shelves that are kind of coming down in the work. Those are torn apart pieces of pine cone. And then all these plants that you see within there are things that I find in my garden. Usually anything that survives, and you understand this, Nathan, anything that survives a Minnesota winter is hardy enough to use in a piece of artwork because it's survived the wind, the rain, the snow, and everything. And if it's still standing tall at the end of, winter, then it's going to survive shipping to New York. Sometimes I should say, because some companies are pretty rough. But if you move to the next slide, you can see another work that is typical of two-dimensional drawing. So in this work, there's a small amount of relief, but mostly this is just typical of a two-dimensional drawing that I would do, where I'm again kind of playing around with these different vignettes, different scenes, and one scene flows into the next. If you'd like to hit the next slide. This particular piece is what I call capture. And I was at Home Depot, and again, thinking about paint and how we use paint to create images. I thought it would be interesting to take just a can of paint that someone returned and just pour it out onto the land and let that paint dry, and then dig it up and then build a landscape on top of that. So what I was going with here, and sometimes my work gets kind of conceptual, and sometimes that, sometimes people pick up on that when they're looking at it, and sometimes not. Then, for me, it's important for me. And sometimes when I tell, like if I tell my mom something about like this work, she'd be like, I'd never get that. She just doesn't care about that. She just cares about what the final image looks like. And the theory or whatever is kind of lost on her. But for me, that's like half the artwork is, that important kind of element. So in a work like this, on the bottom of this thing, it's actual dirt from the land where I poured the stuff out. And then I built this idealistic landscape on top of it. So you have like reality, what nature really is, just land. And then you have this artistic material, which is used in my work, up until this point where I was painting, as a way to create the illusion of land. Like I paint a lake and I try to make it look like there's waves on it and so on. But here the paint actually becomes the river or becomes the lake. And then I built these idealistic kind of scenes on top of them where it looks like the paint can is being taken over by, nature. So in this particular instance, the idea of thinking about where paint comes from, or what's paint's relationship within the artwork. If you think historically, like not many people, if you're thinking about Hudson River painters or something like that, they don't really reference paint. Like that's the illusionistic thing. You're not supposed to even think about that. But I thought, in this day and age, I think this was made in like 2017 or something like that. I was like, that would be really irresponsible for me to not be thinking about the consequences of like using plastic paint. Or I had a show where I shipped all the work down to Art Basel in crates. And so here I am, this landscape artist who's shipping all of my work down to Miami in these massive crates and spending all this money to ship them and all this gasoline for the airfare and this and that. And then I get there and I take these pretty little landscapes out and hang them on the wall and ask people not to think about that. So I made a last minute decision to actually bring the crates into the space, and I stacked the crates up on top of each other, and they ended up being like 7 feet tall. And I drilled a hole into one of the crates and put a little LED light in the top of it and built a little diorama inside there so that people could stick their cell phones up to the crate and take a picture of this little diorama inside the crate. Again, bringing awareness to the invisible kind of stuff. Like, so paint is normally supposed to be invisible in your artwork. It's just supposed to be this thing that like helps create the illusion if you're not, a non-objective painter or something like that. If you're actually painting realistic subject matter, usually the paint is like this thing that you try to hide. And so I kind of thought about that in terms of going around to these exhibitions where I'm bringing landscape artwork. And I wanted to make that invisible stuff, like the process of shipping and this and that, visible. So, okay, let's hit the next slide here. Move a little bit quicker through because some of these are kind of redundant. So like in this particular image, I'm using a lot of trash from the land. I used to live on a property where there was like a little bit of a water way coming through. Anytime it rained, all the runoff water would come through and it would bring like the massive, like most amount of garbage I've ever seen in my life. Everything from like, flip-flops to umbrellas. Like I was like, how does an umbrella get all the way down here? But I mean, like, if the water force is hard enough, I guess like it does, but like crazy amounts of garbage. And I would just pick it up and shove it into the work and like utilize it. Next slide. To the Bon Iver album that I worked on with Justin, and doing album covers, music has been one of my favorite things in my, my life. I started a record label when I won the Mcknight Award. I took all that money and just started a record label with it because I thought, I'm never going to be able to play music. I was obviously like in a band when I was in college, and it wasn't very good. And I quit. And at one point I just sold all of my equipment that I had, my guitars and my pedals and all this and that. And ironically, it went to an individual who also lived in Eau Claire and was good friends with like Justin. And we found out about this 20 years later. But so like I quit music and just started working in, visual arts, and still never lost the love of music. So anytime I get the opportunity to do an album cover, I take it, because it's just such a fun process of taking what you hear and turning it into some kind of visual. And especially if it fits the music, like I think I would have a hard time, creating, like Japanese hardcore or something like that. Like, so most of the music that I do album covers for, it kind of fits the theme. So it works out, but the challenge is really enjoyable. For this particular piece, I wanted to create this kind of sense of isolation. And so I talked to Justin about what we were going to put in there, and it was an interesting process of working with someone, that whole commercial art element where someone is telling you, I would like you to do this, or I would like you to do that. It's very different than your own studio practice, where you get to sit down and say like, well, here's a white sheet of paper, or maybe it's not going to be white, or maybe it's not going to be a rectangle. It's going to, like doing whatever you want, is very different than having someone kind of collaborate with you and tell you what to do. It's, so for this piece, it turned out being rather successful in terms of like commercialism, which is a weird blessing and curse, right? Because I can be in Germany and sitting down at a coffee shop, and someone can come up to me and say, oh, you are artist, what is it you do, and then I'll be like, I do like landscape paintings that are kind of like, relief, they're kind of 3D, I make models or whatever, and they'll be like, oh, okay, and they're just kind of like, whatever. And I go, well, have you seen the Bon Iver cover? Like, oh, Bon Iver, I love, and it's like, they're able to, I'm able to use this thing as a portfolio, essentially, because it's ubiquitous around the world. But also then the interesting thing that comes about with that is that, it's ironic that people then only think that that's what you do. So it's funny, like I sell prints of this artwork, and I'll sell like a print or two a week. And part of me wants to say, like, you do know I have other works, right? Like, have you looked at the other stuff? Like, so it's weird that like, it's sometimes interesting how people are only interested in it because it was popular, as opposed to like going a little bit deeper and mining a little bit further into what the work was about. Okay, so next slide. And you can let me know how I'm doing in terms of time, Nathan, as well. So, okay. Give me like a thumbs down when it starts getting too long. This is a particular work where I started working with three-dimensional elements that are coming out, and all of the work, all of the stuff that's in this thing is created from the shipping materials that came with the board that I was working on. So this is a whiteboard, and this is one of those things that I was talking about, the adaptation. So here I am working at this high school. It's 40 kids every hour. My lunch period comes along and I'm just cashed. I'm like, I need to just listen to music. And for so long, I had kids come in my room and work during lunch hour, and they would eat their lunch in there, and they just draw, and we'd talk about, whatever. It's kind of like everything was like off the book. And at this time period, I was like, no, I can't take anyone. Like, I need like 20 minutes of my own time. And during that 20 minutes, I just put on music and I would start drawing on the whiteboard. And I first did a drawing with dry erase marker. And, it was just like this big cityscape. And then the kids came in and I started spraying it with water because I needed to use the board for, instruction. And I noticed the way the thing fell apart. It was intriguing to me. because it didn't fall apart the way I thought it would. Like I thought it would either like bleed out and just kind of like, you know, do this, or like that it would like turn into like little dots. But what happened is like chunks of, like if I had drawn a line across the whiteboard, a chunk of that line had fallen, and then another chunk fell, and then another chunk fell, and it was like it fell in like bricks, which was intriguing to me. I was like, "Oh, that's cool!" Like I never would have anticipated that the dry erase would fall apart like that with water. So then I purposefully did a bunch of drawings in which I filmed it, and like, you know, filmed the whole thing falling apart in this interesting way. And then I thought, well, what happens if I don't use dry erase, but I use like marker, you know, like a different type of marker? And so like then, you know, got in trouble because that stayed up there and it didn't do anything. So I had to like scrub it away quickly. And then I tried ink. Like what happens if you use India ink? Well, then I saw like this non-porous surface. When you touch it with a little bit of ink, it like bleeds out and blooms, and it's just like watercolor, you know, but it was on a vertical surface. So you would touch the surface and then like this thing would bloom and then just kind of fall down like that. And the cool thing about a non-porous surface is that you could wipe away anything that you did. So within this work, you can see up in the top right-hand corner, there's all these like little geometric shapes. Those are just wiped away after I apply the, you know, this is Sumi ink. So I would take and wet the entire surface of the board, dab it with Sumi ink, you'd get these beautiful blooms that happened, and then you could come back and do something that's much more contrasting to that. So the blooms were like these very organic, beautiful, flowing kind of like gradients of black. And then you come back and you go and cut hard edges into those things. And it was really kind of exciting for me. So I just kept experimenting and experimenting with that process. And I still to this day draw on the whiteboard, searching for some like new thing, some new magical thing to happen. And, you know, out of necessity for staying sane, I created a whole new like type of work that I was interested in. And similar to what we're going through now, like that idea of in hard times, what is it that you can do to stay active and, you know, feed your soul? Because like every artist, every art teacher, like, I mean, we know that feeling that you get when you're creating, it's like the most powerful thing that we have available to us. And when you don't do that, you just feel kind of like, ugh, you know? So for me, to me, like this beautiful work that I see in front of me is a result of a really, really stressful time period. And it flourished into something that became actually like my quote unquote serious work. And if I could just interject a little saying here, I had a friend of mine who I started making work with in the basement of my house in Minneapolis. And we were just playing around. We'd go down there and put music on and roll out a piece of arches that was like 15 feet long. And we just like start scribbling and like throwing paint on it and like drawing little bits here and erasing each other's stuff. And it was just fun. And I wasn't really concerned about like, well, who's going to show this? Like what gallery is going to accept this? Or like, you know, how is this going to photograph? It's like 16 feet wide by 4 feet tall. You know, like I wasn't concerned about any of that. I was just having fun. And eventually all of the stuff that we were doing in those drawings became my quote unquote serious work because it was the most fun. And so what I've learned in my career to trust is that like, if you're enjoying it and it's fun and it's like, you know, something that you're passionate about, that's the place to go. You know, part of being a showing artist is that it also is like a curse in a sense, because people then expect something from you. I mean, I'm sure the same thing happens in music where you write an album and it becomes popular and then everyone wants more of that same thing that you did. You're not allowed to like shift gears and like do something different, because if you do, everyone's like, oh, their next album was blah, 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 you know, like, so I always think about like, you know, it is kind of nice to have shows and gallery representation and so on, but like also then it becomes less acceptable for you to do experimental things because people are like, well, I'm not sure if this is going to sell. There's more pressure on us, I guess what I'm saying. And those areas where it's like you're still making your serious work, but then you're having fun doing this thing over here, those moments I've always learned, like, if this is the thing that's fun, that's what I should be paying attention to. Anyways, next slide. So here's a bit of drawing where I started playing around with like those folds down on the bottom there. I was actually folding paper, but then I was drawing paper to look like it was folded. So again, playing around with representational modes and how do you create an illusion within there? Like, what would this actually be like to encounter? And I think that's one thing that I always keep in my mind when I'm looking at artwork, and certainly when I was jurying this show, I think to myself, what would it be like to live in a world where this thing that I'm looking at is my world? You know, so like if I had to walk into that picture, what would it be like there? And, you know, so for instance, in a piece like this, what's happening here is that we like see this weird kind of landscape, and then the landscape reveals itself as being on paper. So the like thinness of painting, the illusion of depth and so on, becomes debunked within the artwork itself. So then it makes you think like, okay, so if that's not really deep, then what is happening here? You know, I'm looking at a piece of paper that has an illusion on it. And so that, for a long time in my work, that was kind of important to like point out the illusion of depth or the illusion of, you know, creating imagery. Let's move on to the next one here. This is one I did in grad school, the same kind of thing, really interested in like the beautiful movement of lines, the repetition of things. Like, to me, this looks like a musical score. And so much of the work that I did at this point really was about the gesture and creating something that kind of feels musical. Let's move on again here. Similar to this one I did while I was working at school. Often what I'll do is try to do like in the morning before school, I tape down a piece of paper and I just throw a bunch of sumi ink on there and then let it dry. And then by lunch, I'm able to go in and like, oh, I'll put a couple trees in the top part here, and then I let it dry. And then it's kind of like any 15 minutes you have, you're just staying focused on one work, but you're trying to like squeeze it in. And the cool thing about this for me is that the students who are interested in you, they'll see this on your desk and be like, so what's that? Like, how are you doing that? And like, they come up front and like actually want to learn from you, but it's not overt. It's not like in their face, like, all right, everyone watch me paint. You know, it's a little bit more like, hey, if you're interested and you're curious, you're going to see that I'm working on this thing up here. And if you have questions, like, ask, you know. And then, so there's always like 3 or 4 kids who are hanging around your desk, like, what happened to that piece yesterday that you were working on? And I was like, oh, it didn't work out. I threw it away. No way. I thought that was cool, you know. And it starts this dialogue with students in a more like, you know, clandestine kind of way, as opposed to, like you said, like, you know, coming out front and being like, well, this is how you paint, you know, because I really don't want students to think like there's any right way or wrong way to paint. It's like, I can teach you how to do things realistically, but after that, it's like, here's this open door of a million different ways that you can approach it. Okay, so let's move on to the next one here. Similarly, lots of trash. Anytime I get a microwave or, you know, fridge sent to me and it's got all this plastic around it, I just think, okay, well, that's going to end up being a painting. So this thing, you can see the frame on there. It's about 9 inches deep. And this particular piece, it was exciting. I had a curator from the Minneapolis Institute of the Arts come down to my studio one day. It was like 2 weeks before the show, and that they were going to open, and they came down and they were like, how come we don't know about you? And I was like, I don't know. Like, I've been here. And they're like, oh, we love this piece. So then they hung this piece up right between an Audubon and a Grant Wood. And for me, I was like, to take my little 1-year-old daughter to the museum, I don't think she'll ever remember it, but at the time it was kind of poignant. I was like, look, here's my work between, you know, these 2 like incredible regionalists and like incredible nature artists. It was kind of humbling to say the least. So this piece has kind of got a special place in it, in my heart, because I was able to exhibit it by two like really cool artists. Okay, next one. This I did for the cover of McSweeney's. It's a literary journal out of, I think, San Francisco. They asked me to create two covers. One was the first collection of Sudanese literature. So South Sudan became its own country, and they put together a collection of literature. And then they also wanted their regular, so they put two volumes together. And I did this piece, but in this piece, it's like, again, garbage, acorns thrown in there, sumi ink, where I'm using stencils to erase parts of it, draw parts of it in. And that band of white across the middle is all the plastic that I collected from like various things, you know, like you go to the grocery store and they give you these plastic bags and you're like, no, I don't want it. And it's already in the bag and you're like, okay. There's corn husks in there. So in the bottom right, you can see like some upside down corn husks. And then I started working with a laser cutter where I was like cutting sheets of paper and just folding them and kind of like putting them together in these interesting patterns, and going out into the landscape and like taking a leaf off of a tree and scanning it in and putting it in Illustrator and then cutting it with the laser cutter and then like putting it into the painting instead of like the actual leaf, putting like these scanned versions of it in. So I was playing around a lot with technology and so on. So let's move on to the next one then. This one is actually like 6 inches deep. It's a little hard to tell from the photograph, but again, playing around a lot with aerial views and different horizontal views. The thing that's always interested me about landscape is that when it's looked at from above, it's usually for a scientific purpose, which is fascinating. So when you think about, or a political purpose. So when you think about people looking at land from above, it's usually to map something or to make a border around something. I have a collector, his name is Serge Lefranc. He lives in Paris, and his job, he works for big oil companies. His job is to go around in airplanes and just look at the topography and tell them, you know what, if you drill there, you're gonna find oil. And so he loves my work, and he understands the contradiction of working for an oil company and loving nature. But, you know, it's like, he's like, well, I have to make a living somehow and whatever. So it's fascinating that when you look at land horizontally, it tends to be about longing. It tends to be about like the scenic, you know, it tends to be about like the great expanses that we can see, you know, scenic turnouts. There never is a scenic turnout where you just look at a wall that's been dynamited away so the road can be there. The scenic turnout is like, oh, look, you're looking over Lake Michigan or something like that. So this like long view is kind of fascinating because it has to do with like romanticism. It has to do with like exploration, and then the aerial view. So when you bring these two views together, like in a piece like this on the bottom left, that's like a city that I made out of styrofoam. And then up above that, there are all these like horizontal views. Bringing those two things together seems valuable to me in terms of like trying to address like what's the totality of how do we understand land. Let's move on to the next one here. This is a typical installation of mine, where I take up a room and kind of fill it with some of these landscape parts. I was interested in the idea of the frame being a window to the world. So traditionally in landscape painting, we think about the frame on the wall as this like window in which you kind of move yourself mentally into. And in fact, you know, like the story of landscape painting is kind of fascinating because like people got money and they started buying these villas out in the countryside, and then they oriented the villas so that it was facing the prettiest view. But then when they came back and like we're in the middle of London and they were like, oh, we've got this beautiful house in London, but there's no view, then they would hire someone to come in and paint a square on the wall and make it look like there's a view there. And they'd have these ballrooms where it was painted with like, you know, vines everywhere and trees everywhere, and it looked like it was out in the countryside. So there's this correlation between industrialization and appreciation of landscape. And so I wanted to make this in this particular one. All these gold leaf frames that held these horizontal, or like, you know, they were horizontal, but they held vertical views of the land. And then this cascading, this was at the Palo Alto Art Center. Okay, next one there. This is at the Museum of Art and Design. Same kind of thing. I just like a painting from my Hudson, what I thought a Hudson River Valley scene would look like, and then made it kind of cascade out onto the floor and lift up. And if you look off to the left there through that window, we're at the 5th floor of the building, the MAD building there. And that's Central Park. And so I thought it would be kind of like interesting to tie together this view, which is like the Hudson River Valley of like, you know, people appreciating nature, and then Central Park, which is a completely fabricated park. Like Frederick Law Olmsted built that park on a swamp, and everyone in New York is now like, oh, that's nature. But actually it was just all brought there. Like the boulders were brought in and they designed the whole thing to look like nature, but it's like as fake as it comes. It's like Disneyland. And so I wanted to kind of like utilize that park in my work to create this dialogue between our visions of what is nature, or what's natural, or what's wild. All right, next one there. Here's one I did, and similarly, I did this particular piece in Paris, France. There was a gallery that just said like, hey, come here and live here for a month and make something. So again, all that cardboard that's on the ground, the wall there, those were all things that were shipped there with. So I did a couple paintings on whiteboard, but as I looked at it, I was like, I separated the shipping supplies from the actual thing that I was going to use. And I looked at the shipping supplies far outweighed the actual boards that I was going to work on. And so I was like, I need to make an installation out of this shipping supply. So that entire wall in the back there is all the masonite that came, like hardboard that came surrounding those things, and all that cardboard that's there came surrounding those things, and so on. So I just kind of like built this installation. But just to kind of show you a little bit of like what goes into the work. Those curtains there, I painted those curtains on the side of the window. It's backlit, so there's like actually a light behind it. And at night when you walked by the gallery, you just got to see this thing looking like it was a, you know, like a sunset, because it only lit that painting that I did in the background. But on the curtains, there's selenium, which is an element that is used in cell phones. And it's only mined in a certain area. And so it's called a conflict mineral. So it's something that we all have in our cell phones, yet if we knew how it was obtained, we would like want to throw up, right? Because I mean, it's just like the worst of worst situations. It's like blood diamonds times whatever. Because it gets like no attention, because like certainly if it got attention and Apple had to like stop sourcing that stuff there, they would like, you know, have a real issue. And that thing that's on the ground down there is actually a French Guiana, which in South America, France owns a section of South America that is under, you know, colonialism. It's French rule, but they allow all this stuff to go on there that they would never allow in France. So there's gold mining that, and all the tailings get shoved down the stream, and all these natives that live there are like, we're all dying at like unbelievable rates. Like, what's the problem? And they're like, oh, don't worry about it, nothing. And so France has to like atone for what they're doing there, and they really kind of like just push it aside. Now there's been all sorts of conflict recently about this area, but anyways, I put this map of this place down on the floor, and then that scene that's through the window is Corsica. And so Corsica is another French-owned territory that's basically, you know, like a tourist hotspot for all these French people to go and like hang out. But it's also kind of like a weird mobster land. It's very like dangerous. And anyways, France owns these territories still that, you know, we think of France as being like a modern, you know, nation, or I guess a country. But they still have ties to colonialism that are kind of disgusting. And I think like right now, this day and age where we see what's happening in the world, that stuff is going to become more and more under a microscope, and people are going to have to kind of own up to it, you know. Hopefully these protests continue and we see people becoming more and more aware of what's been going on and what has been going on in the world, more so than like Aunt Jemima bottles. You know, there's bigger picture stuff out there than that. While it's nice to see Aunt Jemima, you know, canceled, it would be nice to see like people atone for, like, hey, remember when you came to America and told the Native Americans that you were going to give them land and sign treaties with them and then broke those treaties? Like, what are you going to do about that? Like, those kind of things would be nice for us to kind of keep snowballing. So this piece was like a very political piece that was fun for me to do, because it kind of like, in France, there's a certain air of we can do no wrong. And I was like, yeah, but what about this? Okay, next one. This is probably my best work.
Yeah, Greg, thank you for that. This is, I think, our placeholder for shifting gears into to one of our exciting parts of the program. As many of you who submitted work might remember from previous years, or from maybe something that enticed you to want to submit, we do have Greg as a juror, not just to check out everyone's work, but also to talk a little bit about each of the 4 pieces that he chose as the most interesting or the most exciting for him. And within each of these pieces of work, our office will reach out to the award winners and will send you along a little art supply gift card to help you with your personal studio practice throughout the summer to keep it going. So I will continue to be a slideshow master here, but Greg, I'll let you take it back. Whoop.
Okay, so this particular work, let me just start over here. When I chose the works that I chose, it was because maybe this was a good representation of a series of works that I had seen or been very interested in. So I didn't want to, you know, like, let's say there were like 5 really great realist works. I didn't want to pick all 5 realist works and like omit any that were abstract or some that were non-objective or something like that. So I tended to move towards like finding what I felt was the most representational of like the works that I saw in that certain genre or category, and the ones that spoke to me the most. And this particular work had this kind of had this feel of like a Jasper Johns, where it like looked like bands of silkscreen, you know, kind of moving in and out, layered over the top of each other. Clearly, I don't know if this is silkscreen, but I mean, it just had that kind of format to it, where it looked more like assemblage than something that was like carefully thought out and drawn in one entirety. So it seemed to be pieced together. And I really appreciate that kind of approach, and that not being afraid to take different media and throw them together and see how they connect, you know. So this very black and white image that we see down in the front, in the foreground, the largest square there, the contrast of those white marks within that black background, and then the kind of rouge-ish lines, kind of like, you know, brown drawn lines that are in there, also kind of have this feeling of water. But I like that shift between photographic and then contour line drawing. That kind of play between the different modes, again, is appealing to me. But also in just like a mixed media land, I loved the format of this and how it was broken down. And so I was the yearbook advisor, and I worked on yearbook in high school. And this just reminded me of like, how can we break this page up and make it interesting? You know, like the rhythm of the you know, elements that you see within there. And it just like overall the colors, the muted palette, where it has this kind of like depth to it. It looks almost as though there's like layers of like bar top, you know, like resin layered over the top of each other, kind of creating this murky substance. But then nothing is really identifiable. And I also enjoyed that. There was nothing in here that I could latch onto and say, I get it. And so it really made me kind of inquisitive. And I think that's the reason why this piece stuck out in my mind, is because even though those circles maybe look like water, I was still struggling to see, like, you know, is that biological? Is that natural? Like, what is, you know, are those rocks or are those cells? And for an artwork to make me excited, I have to have a question. Like, I have to be like, what is that? So, like, for me, also music, important in my life. And when I hear a piece of music that I think is like way out there, I can't understand it, 9 times out of 10, I go back to it. And I'm like, okay, if I can't understand it, or if it sounds weird to me, that's probably telling me that it's actually interesting. You know, it's not just bad. It's like something is there, but I can't understand it. And therefore I like gravitate towards it to like learn more from it. So this piece was fascinating to me.
And this was your honorable mention, and the artist's name is Jamie Varasconi. And then the next slide is your third place winner, and this is Josh Bresci.
Yeah, so being a landscape artist, I just thought that this was kind of a fascinating way to depict landscape. Like, the clouds feel like concrete or tangible, and there's this definite like weight to the piece. So I love the S curve, like the bend of the substrate within this. It feels as though like this is almost like a spine, you know, and like each one of these things are vertebrae stacked up, and like this weight of the sky is kind of like making the whole thing kind of like bulb out. And then once we reach, you know, the land down on the bottom, the way that the land is kind of segmented up and pieced together, and it just had like this very beautiful lyrical quality to it, almost like watching a leaf fall from a tree, the way that the kind of like pattern takes this, you know, kind of like a seesaw motion. But also like inherent in any time you do a landscape like this and break it up, I felt like it had this kind of Rothko-esque quality that I appreciated. And even like these weird little cutout areas within there, and the areas that are coming out also had this kind of Salvador Dali-ish kind of quality to it, where there's like, you know, like little recesses that are in these like kidney bean shapes. And then I just loved the surface like mark making. You know, it wasn't I mean, if you look closely at, let's say, that large shape that runs through the middle, kind of in the more desolate area of orange, that shape has like this blue shadow underneath it and this white highlight on top of it, and like there's 1,000 marks within there that kind of make this thing feel like it has volume. And then not only is the illusion there of the highlight and shadow, but it's actually coming out from the painting. So of course, you know, me being interested in the kind of modes of representation and illusion and like debunking that illusion within the work, it's interesting to see something that's meant to look like it's standing out actually also be standing out. So ultimately it's just a fascinating piece that had lots of like beautiful little details in there, renderings, and just the motion of the kind of vertical sing-song nature of it coming down, mixed with the horizontal mark making within each of those pieces, had a really nice contrast.
Great. All right, for your second choice, we have Cara Dune, or is it Dunny? But Cara, congratulations.
Yeah, when I first saw this, you know, this is a risk that we, like in this day and age where people are looking at everything as slides, usually on a screen. Back in the day, I think that everyone gave people physical slides and they looked at them huge, one at a time on a slide projector. Now it's like, oh, everyone gets their little JPEGs sent in and you get this massive wall of JPEGs to look at. And then, you know, if it's not like super exciting and pow, bam, boom, it might get lost. So I scrolled through all the entries like 7 times before I even like kind of like zoomed in. And I was just thinking to myself, wow, the ones that look great as JPEGs aren't necessarily the ones that are great full-sized. And some of the ones are more subtle and like subdued. And when you look at them full size, you're like, that's gorgeous. So I have to caution myself when I'm jurying things, like to not just take the JPEG, the small thing as the thing, you know, like to give space to it within your viewing, like to look at it in a slideshow and give yourself like several seconds with each work, because it's hard. You know, the digital age, just we're so consumed with like, you know, thumbing through Instagram and like just skipping through images and so on, that to stop and look at this piece, the amount of detail in this thing is incredible. And it's beautiful. Like, look at that piece of plywood down there. At first I was like, that's a photo transfer or something like that. And then I went in closer and zoomed in on it and saw that the wood textures that we see within this work are just stunning, masterfully handled. And then there are like these areas off to the right where the fence just becomes almost abstract. And so I loved the like sheer amount of detail in that like weather vane turret thing that's coming up out of this house. And then, you know, the abstraction of the fence off on the right where there's almost no detail in it. And then the amount of detail that's happening within that piece of plywood, that contrast was really kind of interesting to me. And of course, again, like the white background is just like the omission of any kind of atmosphere, or, you know, it's clear then that this is the thing we're supposed to be paying attention to. And when I look at this thing overall, I think, what is this thing? Like, if this thing is in that bad of repair that it has all of these like hodgepodge pieces put on it, how did that thing on the top with the weather vane remain so perfect? You know, so there's this just like a lot of questions that this made me ask. You know, a ramshackle tin roof with this beautiful thing on top of it like that. Like, I don't know if I've ever seen anything like that. Like, I have a tin roof barn, which used to be a blacksmith studio back in like 1910 or something like that. And there's no like beautiful gable on top or whatever that thing is. There, you know, it doesn't have that on top. So it looks almost like this is like pieced together. And that just kind of made me like do the little dog looking at its master, you know, like, what is this? So there was that inquisitiveness about it, as well as just like the masterful way that it was handled.
Yeah, beautiful piece. All right, and your top choice is Joanne Oliver.
So I saw on the, you know, I wasn't given the titles of the work necessarily, but do you know what the title of this piece is? I saw on the slideshow that.
Yeah, we do have the titles in a separate slideshow that of just the four chosen pieces that will play with the school districts and the information. So we'll share that as soon as we're done talking about this piece.
Yeah. So when I looked at this piece, it just, we live in St. Peter, which is like 45 minutes south of Minneapolis. And George Floyd had just been murdered and the riots were happening. And here I was looking at this piece and I couldn't help but make a correlation between some kind of civil unrest or some kind of scene of protest and what was happening. And of course, we know that once an artist makes a piece of work, it's out of their hands, right? Like, you can't control what the meaning is. I mean, you could stand in front of your painting all day long and be like, no, this is what it means. And I, as a viewer, would have the right to be like, no, actually, this is what it means to me, right? The death of the author. So when I looked at this piece, obviously I was projecting a lot of my own kind of anxiety onto it. But I couldn't help but see, like, you know, it looked like this person in the foreground that's dripping paint was like throwing something, and it looked like there was tear gas and like, you know, clouds of stuff all around them. And then there's this weird ominous figure that's walking away that looks like it has like a top hat on. And that just was like so curious to me. But amidst all this turmoil and like all this smoke and all this kind of like roughly rendered kind of like, you know, there are these like little plants growing and these little streams. And at first I struggled with that. I was like, this is almost like making pretty out of something that's messy, you know? And then I thought, you know, it was probably like the fifth time I looked at it and I was like, you know what? Maybe those plant shapes that are growing up are like rays of hope. This is like the possibility of growth, that like through all this turmoil, there would be this like beautiful, something growing beautiful from it. So like right now it's ugly, it looks chaotic, it's like turmoil at its worst, but out of that, something beautiful is going to start to grow and climb. And that's the thing that stuck with me in my head. It's not important if that's what the artist was thinking about, I guess. But from my standpoint, looking at it, there was this contrast between the fluidity of the paint, the way that these kind of greens kind of work from one green to the other, to the next, the kind of murky cloudiness of it, and then the real stark overlap of this red kind of ornate design. And for me, that was like enough to be like, you know, this feels like a powerful piece. The composition is so strange in the sense that if my student did this, I'd be like, no, why do you have the figure facing left? You know, like, why are they throwing it off to the left? I would say, like, bring it into the right so that you're bringing the viewer's eye into the piece. But because of that, like unconventional composition in a sense, where the figure on the left is actually inviting us off the page, I feel like it creates that kind of tension that I was talking about, which existed post Floyd being murdered. And so, and also this weird ominous figure that's walking away too. You know, it's like this person has just done something and they're kind of in the mist, and that kind of like top hat on there just seemed very like perfect for the moment. So that's the work that I chose as the, not only is it just like aesthetically, you know, kind of beautiful with all of its greens and drips and marks, but also it held something there in terms of a meaning for me that maybe you could see, maybe not.
Great. Well, thank you, Greg, and congratulations to the winners. And as promised, I will give a quick, here we go, click to exit. I'm going to just pull up the honorable mentions real quick so we can see where everyone is from. FDR High School, St. Andrew's School, Morristown High School, and Medway. Sounds like some New York, New Jersey, and a Massachusetts school. So great to represent the variety of educators from all over. Well, that pretty much concludes our event, but we're happy to answer questions, or if others are wanting to ask Greg anything specific or stick around and engage as a community, feel free. And I'll leave it up to you. You can use the chat function. You're also welcome to unmute yourselves. But we really want to say thank you so much to Greg for taking time out of your day, enduring the work a few weeks ago, and for the great presentation that you gave. I think that was really stellar, and it's always so awesome to understand process and kind of get into an artist's head a little bit to see where they're coming from and what inspires them. Beautiful work, and feel honored that you're a part of Montserrat today, so thank you. So I'll leave it open to anyone who might have any questions for Greg.
I have one if I can jump in. Greg, and maybe this is kind of for everyone too, I'd be curious to hear some thoughts. How are you thinking about, and how are you talking to your students about, you know, art in the screen era? You know, your work is so tactile, so sculptural. You do a wonderful job documenting, and it reads very well on, you know, Instagram, on your website and stuff like that. We, of course, are talking to a lot of our students at Montserrat. You know, how are we pivoting? How are we adapting? You know, when this whole COVID thing hit, we did what we all knew what to do, which is like run to Facebook, run to Instagram, run to the websites. And we saw almost immediately students tailoring their work to fit this new environment. And I'm wondering, kind of like 2.0 version of that, if our students will kind of start off thinking that the screen is the end point and everything else is kind of a superfluous or a bonus. And I'm just curious, yeah, Greg's thoughts, but also some other people's too, whatever you think.
So I'm 46 years old. Like you said, I've had some shows out places, and I've traveled the world and done stuff. Certainly I could have done more, and you know, I think what I'm going to say is different than what 25-year-old me would say. At this point, I'm almost just as happy to do work for myself, and not look for any kind of career out of it than I would have been when I was 25.
Who are you talking to?
So if I was 25, I'd be thinking, how do I get my work seen and looked at and noticed and so on, right? That said, I think when I'm actually making a piece of work, and this is not just during COVID, this is like now in the age of constant social media, I'd be a fool if I said I don't think about, while I'm making work, how this is going to photograph. Because I would say 95% of the people who are going to see my artwork are not going to see it in person, which is a detriment to anyone who works with like a tactile medium, anyone who works with textures, anyone who works with whatever, so like as I'm working, I'm frequently taking a cell phone and asking myself, how is this going to translate? Which is kind of messed up, right? But that's like the nature of the beast, in a sense. If you are, even more so now, but I mean, like if I'm going to have a show in San Francisco, you might have 600, 700 people come out. And then the rest of people are going to see that on the internet. And so thinking about ways in which you can document your work and make that quality of three-dimensionality be known within my work is important. But I also think then the people who actually do get to see it firsthand, they have like a much more visceral response to the work. So how do you bridge that gap then, knowing that like most people are not going to have that response with your work? That's just kind of the nature of what the trade-off that we've made. We've said it's more like interesting to have friends over like these devices where we text each other and so on than actually like hanging out and not having a set plan or whatever, like we've said that it's okay to live life through the screen. And there's trade-offs, being a record label owner, like the reason why I made the records and handmade all the album covers is because I wanted to have like a physical tactile experience for the person, like that idea of like, you get this cool object, you take the record out, you might scratch it. So like you're careful with it. I noticed that was the antithesis of my MP3 experience, because I was like, well, if I lost this hard drive, I've got it all backed up. So like, no big deal. I'll just go download it again. That way of living life where you don't really view anything that's like anything has importance or value. There is no like aura of the original anymore. Everything is just kind of like, throw it away, whatever. That's kind of like the opposite of my work. So how do you negotiate that? It's like, I guess you have to do it through a medium like social media and take videos and lots of pictures from different angles. And like, that is kind of cool, that like before Instagram or before social media, how many people were seeing your work, So like you had a show in San Francisco and 700 people saw your work, and then there wasn't the other 95%. So with this gift of social media and like having followers and so on, you have this opportunity to reach more people, but you're reaching more people in a kind of like a disconnected way. But you just do your best, I guess. It's probably a 6.5 dozen the other type of thing.
Great. Well, thanks again, Greg. This is exciting. I hope that we can have you on campus at some point and have your work on campus. And I hope that you'll continue to inspire your students. But what an opportunity to have you here, and I appreciate you being here for the last 90 minutes with the art educators that we love to support, and hopefully we can support you and your cause as well moving forward.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, this is wonderful. All right, with that, everyone, I want to thank everyone and all the participants, congratulate the award winners, and congratulate all the artists who shared your work. 70 participants is one of our highest numbers, and we can't wait to have you on campus and have even more of your artwork in our gallery spaces next summer. All right, with that, stay safe, stay cool, and we'll talk to you soon.